Of motion number 5, Ms Webb to move a motion concerning poker machine use in Tasmania.
Honourable Member for Nelson.
Mr President, I begin by acknowledging the Moonina people as the original owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. Nipaluna Hobart of Lutruwita, Tasmania. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I pay my respects to any members of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community here today. I acknowledge the continued connection the Aboriginal community has with this land despite invasion and dispossession. Mr President, I'm speaking today in circumstances that are very different to what I had hoped and imagined we might have around this motion. We are in the midst of an uncertain and very serious health epidemic that casts a certain light on all the discussions we have, and it certainly changes the way we feel about being here and having discussions of any sort in the first place. We're all concerned, I know, about the health situation playing out in our communities, in our families, and indeed for ourselves. I know we're also concerned about the flow-on impacts from this situation that we find ourselves in. We don't know what's going to happen to the businesses in our state, to the activities that we involve ourselves in, to the way our future might look 6 months from now. So I'm very mindful of that as I stand here. I'm particularly mindful of vulnerable people at this time. And I know that that's a concern that's shared by many. We know that there are lots of people in our community who will be finding this time especially difficult, and that their lives will be made even more challenging by the changes to normal everyday routines, by the stress and anxiety that's caused, and by the things that will be asked of them. That will play out in many ways in many families, and there's already, I know, information being made available to people for extra support services and extra forms of assistance that might be needed in this time. What I think this shows us is really absolutely starkly the interconnection of any issue that we might talk about, but particularly I think it links well to one of the points in my motion which we will discuss today, which is about the fact that matters to do with poker machine regulation don't sit in isolation. The way we choose to deal with this product, the way we choose to support people who we know are harmed by it, these are not things that sit separate to the other core issues of our lives. Things like our housing situations, our finances, our employment, our health, our mental well-being, our children's lives, their education and their future. All these matters are interconnected, and we see that playing out absolutely clearly in this crisis. It shows us, with these interconnections highlighted so starkly, that if we fall down in our responsibilities in one area, it makes it all that much harder to weather a crisis, because we find people who have already perhaps been left behind in some sense being further harmed or disadvantaged or left behind. This morning when I was doing some radio, I actually made a call that something we should be thinking about as a key, both health and social measure, is closing gaming venues in this state right now for the foreseeable future. Just the gaming rooms. We know that across the next few weeks, sitting in front of those machines won't be recreational players. It won't be the people who might just be popping in on a Saturday night as part of a greater and more enjoyable activity. Anybody sitting in front of a poker machine over the next short while is going to be somebody who's got a problem with that machine, somebody who is addicted to that machine or at risk of addiction. And not only will their health immediately and directly be impacted by sitting there interacting with that piece of equipment and perhaps in proximity with others, even more, their long-term well-being will be in jeopardy also as they continue to be losing money to those machines because of the issue that they have. And at a time that we are providing stimulus to our community to try and keep our economy ticking along and provide good economic benefit to a whole range of areas of our economy, the last place we want to see that stimulus go is into a poker machine. So I called for that on the radio this morning, and I note really, I'm very pleased to note that some messaging came out mid-morning that one of the measures that actually will be considered this afternoon in Federal Cabinet that may be included in protective measures is actually the closing of gaming room venues. So that would be great to see that. I think it would be beneficial for our state on many levels. So I'm mindful that people are feeling very uncertain and wary today, people even here in this chamber. I know there's an awkwardness to the arrangements we have around us, and that people may be coming and going and finding it difficult to engage with this motion. I've modified my speech on the hop just now to try to help accommodate the awkwardness of that and have this process be given what I believe is the prominence, the respect and the honour it deserves of a really decent conversation, while being mindful of our present situation and people's uncertainty and concerns. So I hope that members will be forbearing with me as I go through this speech, because I've modified a hard copy on the hop, and I may at times be struggling to keep a thread if I'm skipping past pages I've cut out. So thank you in advance for your forbearance. Mr. President, I first began to learn about our state's policy and regulatory arrangements regarding poker machines in late 2015. At that time, I had recently started working at Anglicare Tasmania as the manager of the Social Action and Research Centre. While poker machines were a very new area of public policy to me, it was an area of long-standing research, policy development, advocacy and campaigning for Anglicare. In fact, over close to 3 decades, Anglicare has published dozens of research reports, policy documents, submissions and resources on the issue of poker machine policy and regulation. Because of the circumstances that began to play out in late 2015, matters relating to the poker machine reform became a very large part of my paid work role. And over the course of the intervening years, I believe I can lay claim now to being probably one of the most well-informed people in this state on this topic. And I say that with particular deference to the superior knowledge of my Anglicare colleague Margie Law and to the unique scholarship of Dr James Boyce on this topic, along with a handful of others who have long-standing experience and insight. In addition to the knowledge and experience built in my work over this time, I have also developed a personal, passionate commitment to the potential for positive reform of poker machine policy and regulation in this state of Tasmania. It's a result of both my expertise and my personal commitment that I have tabled this motion for us to consider today. It's timely for us as an upper house, Mr President, to take this opportunity to consider the matters covered in this motion. Tasmania is at an important juncture on this issue. We have an opportunity from 2023 to reshape this policy and regulatory arrangement relating to poker machines in this state. Our chamber will have a key role to play in the decisions made towards that reshaping, and we will be called on to participate in that decision-making this year. The upper house indeed has historically played a very important role at similar moments. It's because of the scrutiny, consideration and rigorous debate by the upper house that a gaming commission was established in Tasmania, that the community support levy was funded and the regular social and economic impact studies were initiated. Each of these were important contributions made by this chamber, and now the Legislative Council has important work to do again. I would like to acknowledge right now that there will be people, perhaps in this room, perhaps listening, that are personally experiencing harm caused by poker machines. To those people, I acknowledge the difficulties that today's discussions may present. I apologise for the pain that it may cause. I know that while we will be talking facts and figures, for you, this is a painful reality that is lived every day. It's been impossible for me to have listened these past 4.5 years to the personal stories and not be struck to the very core of my heart by the pain and the waste that's resulted from the presence of this product in our state under the circumstances that we allow it to exist. In speaking here today, I plan to recognise and honour that pain which affects so many Tasmanian families. I'll make sure that we don't just discuss the facts and the figures, but that we also directly hear the voices of those who are living this. And although it might be awkward with the adjustments I've made in my speech, I'm trying to make sure that those parts will be retained. The motion that I put to the chamber in the first instance makes a point about Australia and how it compares with the rest of the world. My motion asks the Council to note that Australia, with the exception of Western Australia, has an approach to poker machine policy and regulation that is significantly different to similar countries. Australia has high total number of poker machines and higher numbers of pokies per capita, higher bet limits, higher maximum payouts, higher losses per capita. I'll provide some detail on each of those points here briefly. But firstly, let's look at higher numbers of pokies per capita. Most of the figures I'm about to share come from the Gaming Technologies Association that produces the world count of gaming machines annually. To start with, it's important to note that not all states and not all countries permit poker machines. Our local example in Australia is Western Australia. They don't permit them in their local communities, only in casino environments. Other countries, other states in other countries have many similar arrangements, either not allowing them at all or allowing them under certain circumstances, such as in destination gambling venues. Looking at the total raw number of machines, Australia ranks 6th by country, behind Japan, the US, Germany, Italy and Spain, all countries that have significantly higher populations than Australia. With 0.3% of the world's population, Australia has close to 20% of the world's poker machines, which means when we look at the per capita figures worldwide, we are exceeded only by gambling resort destinations such as Macau, Monaco and the Caribbean. I'm going to talk about high intensity. Australian and Tasmanian machines are also different from those that you would find in most other countries. They are what is called higher intensity. What does that mean? Mr. President, in simple terms, it refers to how fast you can play and how much money you can lose. Technology means the intensity of all poker machines can be programmed by altering various key functions that relate to how fast you can lose money and how much money you can lose. These features include bet limits, spin speeds, jackpot limits and more. In the simplest terms, the higher these features are set, the higher the intensity of the machine. Because all of the features are programmable, each country or state is able to decide what rules and regulations it will set to determine the intensity of the machines in their jurisdiction. We will talk more about these features at further points in my motion. In Australia, though, compared to other countries, our machines are of particularly high intensity. A small example of that, in the UK, venues which they define as being closest to the community have very low maximum bet limits of 17 cents and jackpots of $14 are allowed. They step it up a bit in their venues, in their machines in pubs. In the UK, a pub can have a machine with a maximum bet limit of $2 and a maximum payout of less than $200, the equivalent. Higher losses in pubs, but still unable to be devastating losses generally. We compare that to the poker machines here in Tasmanian pubs. Whereas the UK was a $2 bet limit, ours is $5. Whereas our maximum payout is set at $25,000, theirs was only $200. For further comparisons, you can refer to a table that Anglicare present in their supplementary submission to the Joint Parliamentary Inquiry in 2017. Another quick example of Australia and Tasmania's global comparison in terms of jackpot limits is that maximum jackpot limits for poker machines in hotels and clubs here in Australia varies between $10,000, which is New South Wales and South Australia, up to $25,000, Northern Territory and Tasmania, and no specified limit at all, which is ACT, Queensland and Victoria. And while other countries deal with this quite differently, we've heard about the UK with the $200 limit. New Zealand allows $1,000. We have Quebec with $1,000 and Ireland at the other end of the scale with $1. These figures show that Australia is a global outlier in regards to the intensity of the machines that we allow, especially in our community-based venues. And we see that result in the level of losses we permit. The motion mentions higher levels of harm. There are challenges, Mr. President, to directly compare the level of harm caused by gambling. This is because of a number of factors. Firstly, the way the harm is defined is different in different jurisdictions. Secondly, the way the harm is measured is different in different jurisdictions. And thirdly, there's a lack of data measuring the comorbidity of gambling harm with other issues. That's something we'll talk more about in this motion. So what can we look at to give us a good picture of the level of harm? It might seem most obvious to compare the prevalence rates for problem gambling between jurisdictions, but as I'll explain further later on, this is particularly difficult to do and is acknowledged as fairly inaccurate. So other broad indicators we can use for the level of harm includes the level of losses and the accessibility of the machines. Having heard about the comparatively high number of machines that are located here in Australia, including Tasmania, and the comparative intensity of those machines, members will not be surprised to hear that Australia also leads the world in gambling losses. According to The Economist, Australians lose almost double the amount lost by New Zealanders, Americans, Canadians and Brits. It's even worse when we look just at poker machine losses from community venues, because in pubs and clubs, Australians lose 3 times as much as New Zealanders and Finns, and 6 times more than Americans and Brits. If you'd like to see more comparisons, I commend a report to you, which I believe Anglicare provided to all members last week, that contains even further details of these comparisons.
In fact, they had 2 or 3 attachments to that.
Indeed.
Very interesting read.
Indeed. I'm skipping through. Excuse me while I gather where I'm up to. I'm going to talk about the matter in the motion, which is point B, and it's about the machines being designed to addict. In fact, the motion says poker machines typically in use in Australia are designed and programmed to include features that increase the likelihood of addiction, with evidence suggesting that normal use of Australian poker machines is likely to cause addiction in 1 in 6 users. These features relate to spin speed, bet limits, maximum jackpots, near misses, losses disguised as wins and return to player. Poker machines are computers. There is no skill involved. They are programmed by their owners to make money for their owners. They are advertised as fun and entertaining, and yet our Gaming Commission says they can take $600 from a patron in an hour, every hour, remembering that some of our gambling venues are allowed to be open 20 hours a day. It's no accident that poker machines are addictive. The features that make them so are carefully researched, thoroughly understood and purposefully included in the machine design. Len Ainsworth, founder of Aristocrat, the leading Australian and world-leading pokies manufacturer, told ABC's Four Corners in 2000 that the secret to the success of poker machines was, and I quote, building a better mousetrap. Let's think on that for a moment. The manufacturers of poker machines are, by their own proud admission, purposefully building human mousetraps and making them more and more effective. This deadly analogy is no accident. I'll quote from Anglicare's supplementary submission to the parliamentary inquiry here in 2017, where on page 11 of that submission they say, Machine designers describe two polar opposites in the way people use machines, with many gradations in between. There are action, jackpot, or play to win people who are willing to lose large amounts of money for the hope of winning the jackpot. For play to win people, the industry designs machines with dramatic spikes in its payout model to allow occasional large payouts and where the payout reaches zero relatively quickly. That is, the person runs out of money quickly. Their report continues, Mr. President, and I quote, the industry also designed drip feed machines for what it calls escape, time on device, or play to win to play people. These machines are programmed to dispense constant small payouts, known as reinforcements in psychology, that nibble away at a person's money until it's all gone. As a poker machine game designer explains, the industry thinks some people want to be bled slowly. End of quote. I note that analogies to mice come up not infrequently in talking about poker machines. We have a mousetrap, we're talking about nibbling. I think it will come up again. No wonder people get trapped, lose money, lose their homes, lose their families, and ultimately lose their lives when they interact with this machine. As one Tasmanian told Anglicare, and I quote, "I don't know why I gamble. I can't win. There's something that draws me to the machines." And yes, there is. Mr. President, machines are designed to drip feed and keep you sitting in front of them. It allows time for those 1 in 6 people whose normal use of this product will lead to an addiction. The addiction is in fact a chemical one. It's driven by the moment of anticipation that occurs when you use a poker machine. It's not even the result itself that drives it, the win or the loss, but the few seconds during which the game is in play and the person anticipates the result. During those moments of anticipation, the chemical dopamine is released in that person's brain. Mr. President, you may be well aware that's a chemical that makes you feel rather good. It's the chemical that's associated with most forms of addiction. We've all seen videos, I'm sure, of little white mice pressing buttons to give themselves repeated hits of dopamine. And those mice kept pressing the button, forgetting to eat and drink and ultimately putting their lives at risk. Poker machines are exactly the same principle. Pressing a button generates continuous moments of anticipation, which releases hits of dopamine in the brain and keeps the person in the zone. That zone is a place that takes the person away from all their day-to-day worries and problems. People who have a history of trauma or are experiencing stress in their lives are particularly vulnerable to developing addiction to poker machines because of the relief provided by the zone. The greatest tragedy is that the temporary relief that it provides comes at a cost that is too often ultimately ruinous to that person's life. And that's why I'm particularly concerned, Mr. President, that at times of extraordinary stress and uncertainty, such as the one we're in now, people who are perhaps approaching developing a problem, teetering on the edge of developing a problem, may be well pushed by the extra stress and anxiety further into the likelihood of that happening. So let's now look at the specifics of those programmable features of the machines which contribute to the likelihood of addiction. I'm going to try and speak about them briefly. I've cut material out, so we'll see if we can get through it. Spin speeds and bet limits. These are the parameters of the poker machine's computer that set up how quickly people will lose money. And it's not rocket science. The faster the spin speed and the higher the bet limit, the more money the machine is able to take quickly. Our Gaming Commission here in Tasmania says that with Tasmania's current settings of a $5 maximum bet limit, a 3-second spin rate, a person can lose $600 in an hour if they continuously press the button and continuously lose. Now, granted, this is a theoretical maximum because the machines have special features that play side games, meaning the person is not always pressing the button. However, it is possible under the settings that we have allowed the machines to have. Our Gaming Commission over many years has recommended, including most recently to the parliamentary inquiry in 2017, that Tasmanian spin speed settings should be slowed to 6 seconds and the maximum bet limit should be reduced to $1. Doing this would reduce the maximum theoretical loss from the $600 an hour to $60 an hour. That's a 10-fold reduction, Mr. President. It's substantial, and just those two most simple of adjustments would make an incredible difference to the safety, the health, the well-being and, in fact, the lives of tens of thousands of Tasmanians. Why then have Tasmanian governments, including this current Gutwein government, not acted on this straightforward, evidence-based expert advice from the independent body established in our state to provide policy guidance to government? No doubt that is an uncomfortable question, and I'll be interested to hear an answer to it from my colleagues who represent the government here today. What explanation or rationale could there possibly be to not support small adjustments which don't detract from recreational use but make an enormous difference to the harm caused to vulnerable players? Surely that would be like not supporting speed limits on our roads or the installation of airbags in our cars, both of which don't affect normal driving but provide for more safety on our roads to prevent crashes and a much reduced likelihood of harm to those in a car if a crash were to occur. But imagine, Mr. President, if speeding and crashing were what an industry relied on for half of its profit. The poker machine industry in Australia and here in Tasmania take half their profit from people who are being harmed by their gambling, people who are speeding and crashing. Half their profits. That is why the large industry operators in Tasmania oppose these measures. Actually, I'm going to correct that. Oppose is far too mild a word. The industry fights these measures tooth and nail, ferociously, as if their lives depended on it. But they don't. It's their extra profits that depend on it. It's vulnerable Tasmanians' lives who actually depend on it. Big industry operators know these simple, effective measures will work. They work without doubt to significantly reduce the harm caused, and that means industry profits will go down. Which brings us back to my uncomfortable question. Why would Tasmanian governments, including this current government, not have acted on this straightforward, evidence-based, expert advice and implemented responsible public policy in the best interests of the Tasmanian people? It is because they are making a clear choice. They choose to prioritise industry super profits over Tasmanian lives. Literally, the only reason to refuse to introduce these measures is to preserve the current level of industry super profits. Every Tasmanian government that has chosen over the previous 23 years to not implement these simple harm reduction measures is responsible for Tasmanian lives being lost. We see today, in a crisis, the central importance of the government taking responsible, evidence-informed measures to protect our community. Imagine what would happen if government just pretended to do this, just paid lip service to the measures they knew would work. And yet, the government's very own consultation paper currently out in the community for comment on its proposed regulatory framework, out right now, it says, and I quote, "While the government's future gaming market policy does not propose any specific changes to the harm minimisation framework, harm minimisation has continued to be front of mind during the development of the changes to be introduced under the new arrangements. The Government and the Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission, the Commission, will closely observe and monitor the operation of EGMs in Tasmania in the restructured gaming market and will act quickly to address any harm concerns. Mr. President, why on earth would the Tasmanian people believe this to be true when it has certainly not been true to date? I believe this statement from the consultation paper, along with numerous others, amounts to nothing less than gaslighting the Tasmanian community on this issue. Closely observe and monitor? Act quickly to address any harm concerns? They are pretending to protect us. They have not done any of that to date. They don't propose to do that in the material they've presented us to date. Why would we believe that that could be true? The reality is the Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission has closely monitored and observed the operation of poker machines in Tasmania for over 2 decades and has regularly and explicitly raised concerns about the level of harm. In doing so, it has formed clear, evidence-based views on measures which would produce a genuine reduction in harm to Tasmanians. These views, presented to governments past and present, have been almost entirely ignored. Virtually the only harm minimisation measures that have been allowed to be adopted in Tasmania are those approved by the federal group and THA as the most influential players in that industry. And so we find ourselves at a crucial moment where yet again this Parliament will be the decision maker on behalf of the Tasmanian people in determining our public policy approach to poker machines. And yet again we find the Gutwein government has turned its back on the best expert advice and is making the choice to put the super profits of industry ahead of Tasmanian lives. I'm going to move on, Mr. President, to maximum jackpot and return to player rates. I'm not going to speak in detail about these. I had some quite technical notes to speak to and I'm going to put them aside and suggest that if members have questions about it, these aspects such that they can't support my motion, I'd be happy to address them in a summing up at the end. But suffice to say, we've mentioned jackpots already. They do affect the intensity of the machine. They do affect the losses and the addictive nature of the machine. The return to player rate is also something that can be set and programmed. It can be mandated through regulation. We could make improvements to both those things. Similarly, I would speak to the last 2 in that short list under point B, which is about near misses and losses disguised as wins. I don't believe I'll need to speak in too much detail to these. In many cases, they're really just what's on the page. We group them together because they're features of the machines that is designed to specifically suck people in, to keep them sitting there. The industry calls these features the drip feed techniques, like I described earlier. You can find a lot of material and analysis of these features of the machines from Dr. Charles Livingston, who did also speak to the parliamentary inquiry here in 2017. He makes this very technical and mathematical aspects of the machines as accessible as I've ever found them to be, at least. I'm going to move on to point C in the motion. Point C in the motion states that it is possible to modify the design and programming features of poker machines to decrease the likelihood of addiction, such that modifications would have little impact on the recreational use of poker machines by Tasmanians. From our discussions so far today, I trust that members here will have a clear sense that there are a multitude of ways it's possible for us to make poker machines in Tasmania safer and less harmful. Of course, the primary way, chosen by most of the rest of the world, is to only put poker machines in destination gambling venues such as casinos. To me, this remains the best indicated first choice for Tasmania when the current licence ends in 2023. It could be readily supported as a planned restructure of that industry. Independent modelling has shown that it would be an economic boost to our state and a net creator of hundreds of jobs. It would bring Tassie into line with Western Australia, and we could look to that state with its comparatively low levels of pokies harm to see where our state would be headed. For the purposes of the discussion today, let's say we forego our best first choice and retain poker machines in Tasmanian hotels and clubs after 2023. Even if this is our choice, there is so much we can then choose to do to make their use safer. And public policy and legislative decision makers, I argue that it is our primary responsibility to do so. We seem to readily accept this responsibility when it comes to other policy areas, especially when there's a serious impact on health and wellbeing. Again, I'm going to think about road safety here. I see a real mismatch in our approach to the responsibilities of our role in poker machine regulation compared to our approach to road safety. When it comes to road safety, we don't discuss the opportunity for harm minimisation with the argument that only a small % of people are seriously harmed, so we don't have to think about some of the indicated measures that experts might advise. We approach these issues on road safety broadly, across the community, across sectors. We make great efforts across all levels of government to make our roads safer and set rules to help us use them safely, such as speed limits. Many people don't reach the limit. They drive along slower because it suits them. But for those who want to drive fast, the speed limit is there as a safety barrier to protect them and to protect us. There's a sensible decision making in the best interests of the whole community, and yet more people are seriously harmed by pokies in Tasmania than by cars. Just as we must do everything we can to reduce death and injuries on the roads, why would we not do everything we can in the same way for poker machines? We can choose whether to continue licensing this product and the conditions under which we send it out into our communities. This year in Parliament, we have that task ahead of us. I suggest to members that each of us here must answer an ethical question. As a decision maker, if I am aware that these machines can be made considerably safer for my community, what role will I play to make sure this is done? And from our discussion today, and from material you've been provided and have access to, aware is precisely what each of us will be. There is so much local research on how Tasmanian poker machines can be modified to make them safer, from our Gaming Commission, from the Productivity Commission, from numerous academics, and of course from local groups like Anglicare Tasmania. I commend to this place the reports that Anglicare has provided that we spoke of already, particularly the report they wrote for Minister Ferguson providing evidence for a variety of consumer protection measures. Their proposal builds on the work of the Productivity Commission, on our government's own social and economic impact studies, and on our Liquor and Gaming Commission's advice and recommendations. Mr. President, another thing to ask ourselves would be, is there a downside to adjusting those programming features of poker machines, such as spin speeds, bet limits, jackpot levels, return to player rates, near misses and losses disguised as wins? The short answer is no. We can make these modifications with little, if any, impact on the so-called recreational gambler, but with a significant reduction in harm to those who gamble regularly and harmfully. Research backs up the claim that recreational players will not be disadvantaged by changes we might make. Let's break that down a bit more specifically from the research to be clear. We can use the $1 bet limit as an example. Here in Tasmania, our social and economic impact studies that happen every 3 years provide some insight from 2014, our SEIS in 2014, it was found that more than half the people who identify as having a gambling problem, sometimes, usually or always, spend more than $1 per push. In contrast, more than half the people who gamble recreationally, rarely or never, Sorry, let me say that again, Mr. President. In contrast, more than half the people who gamble recreationally rarely or never spend more than $1 per spin. The study found the mean spend by people with a gambling problem is $4 per spin, so the introduction of a $1 bet limit would reduce their mean spend by $3 for every push, cutting the harm by 3/4 right there. Earlier research interstate found the $1 bet limit would reduce time and money spent by problem gamblers while not inconveniencing recreational gamblers. They drive under the speed limit already, Mr. President. And the Tasmanian 2012 House of Assembly inquiry into the proposed $1 bet limit, which had been supported at one time by the Tasmanian Liberal Party, found that 85% of people already bet at or below $1 per spin. It's those Tasmanians in the 15% who spend more than $1 that would be protected by introducing this limit, not inconvenienced. Mr. President, I'm going to move on to the Part D of the motion, which notes that the impact of harm caused by poker machine use on Tasmanian health and mental health services, family support services, welfare services, criminal justice services, domestic violence services, housing and homelessness services, productivity and level of unemployment is not currently measured and monitored by the Tasmanian Government so as to effectively inform policy development and regulation relating to poker machines. I think this is a really key point. It's the interrelation that I spoke about when I was in my introduction. Poker machine use doesn't exist in a vacuum. Evidence, which we'll talk about briefly, points to the fact that it is connected to many other issues and challenges that people in our community face. While research and evidence makes these connections, our policy making fails to do that at this point because we don't equip ourselves with the best understanding of what these connections look like. Throughout the end of last year, each time we sat here in the chamber, I asked numerous questions relating to data we might have as a state on some of these connections. I wanted to know about what the Tasmanian Government had at its disposal in terms of information or data or measurements that might be able to inform us of the connections between gambling harm and other service systems and allow us to make better connected policy decisions across those spaces. Most of those questions I asked in the second half of last year remain unanswered on our notice paper. Even today, of the answers provided, none of them were in relation to those questions that I asked late last year. I did receive, though, one prompt reply. That was from the Minister for Mental Health, which indicated that no information, and I'm summarising here, but of the questions I asked that related to mental health issues, the answers indicated that no informative data is collected on the proven connection that exists in that policy area between gambling harm and mental health issues. Without answers to the questions, I can only believe that there will probably be a similar lack of data that's collected and a subsequent lack of policy consideration that is informed of the impact of poker machine harm in all of these other areas of government responsibility, but I've yet to receive it, so we'll wait and see. In the absence of data from the Tasmanian Government, I'm going to address these matters today with what we know from research, and perhaps more importantly, I'll share with you stories from real Tasmanians about their experiences that illustrate these connections. These stories I will tell as snippets from research and advocacy and service provision from across the state. Some of them also come from an open letter that was put out to the public during 2016 and 17 It was an open letter to then Premier Hodgman, and people could sign on to support the open letter, and they could also make a personal comment if they wished to add to that letter. 6,663 people signed that open letter in 2017, and over 1,000 Tasmanians chose to put a personal comment with it. And the stories and the matters that those comments cover are really informative, and I want to draw on some of those today too. First, briefly, let's talk about health and mental health. Research tells us, Productivity Commission research tells us, also the Australian Medical Association, the Public Health Association, all concur that gambling harm is associated with poor health outcomes. People with severe gambling problems have been found to have an incidence of poor health that is twice that of people experiencing low-level gambling problems. So that's comparing people who, all of them are in a category of risk, but even between low-level harm gamblers and severe gambling problems, there's a doubling of poor health outcomes. As one Tasmanian describes, I would feel washed out. My blood pressure would go up, my sugar would go up, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I would have starved if my sister didn't help me out. Gambling problems may precede or be a cause of depression and anxiety. About 50% of people with gambling problems experience depression, and about 1 in 5 people harmed by gambling report that they're often or always feeling depressed because of gambling. The Productivity Commission also found that almost all people seeking counselling help for gambling suffer depression. We should expect that these impacts would affect service delivery in our health and mental health sectors. In terms of mental illness, I think we here all understand that people with a serious mental illness can experience a high level of social isolation and find it extremely difficult to participate in the community at times. Research finds that an insidious aspect of gambling on poker machines is that it appears to offer people, and I quote, a social activity, an escape from loneliness, and often their only chance for social interaction. But, as one research participant said, I've had a mini breakdown recently. I'm on antidepressants just to keep myself on a level playing field. When I'm on that level playing field, I know the machines are evil. I want to keep away from them. But the minute I run out of my medication, I'm back down there because I'm hearing those tunes and they're calling to me and I can't seem to help it. I'm going to touch onto the issue of suicide here, Mr. President, and before I do that, I'm going to mention that anybody who feels they require some support is strongly encouraged to ring Lifeline. The number's 131114 13 11 14. The Productivity Commission found that 60% of people in gambling counselling had contemplated suicide because of their gambling, and 10% of people in gambling counselling had attempted suicide. One Tasmanian shared her story. One night, I had gone through about $4,000. I had a packet of Valium and a packet of Serapax. I couldn't tell my husband how much I had lost, so I took the whole lot of the tablets. He took me to hospital, and at that stage he didn't know why I had taken the tablets. This lady was hospitalised and tried self-exclusion, but she returned to the pokies at her local again. My sister and I would talk on the way there about playing on the machines, and on the way home we would talk suicide. What are we going to do? Now let's look at the impact on families. First, relationship stress and breakdown. The Productivity Commission found that nearly 20% of people with gambling problems felt they did not spend enough time with their family, and 42% of people with gambling problems had argued with family over money in the last year. Their survey also found that people with a gambling problem experienced higher rates of relationship breakups than people who do not have gambling problems. a partner of someone who couldn't control his gambling on pokies, told researchers, "Well, I won't talk to my partner. I will say that I'm not keeping him for the fortnight and remind him he won't get paid for another fortnight. I will get the kids things. I will go without myself so the kids have things. We just won't talk and we'll have a bad relationship." And another person, someone who gambled, said this: "I can't hold down a relationship because of gambling. I'll say that I'm just down the road to get some milk or bread, but I'll find myself at an Oasis venue and lose all track of time. I broke up with the mother of my children because of my gambling." And this next experience seems to sum it up. It's almost like there are two worlds: normal people and people with various addictions. I class myself as a normal person, but my family took a look upon me as just the gambler. I feel the spotlight is just on that part of me. And then he explained the effect his gambling had on his family. "The gambling has wrecked everything. My marriage has gone, and I've been divorced since the end of 1999. We had properties together, but they've gone and been sold off. I'm currently bankrupt and have been for 3 years. It's pretty awful. My wife had an inkling, but it all came out in the divorce proceedings. I get along fine, but the reality is the whole world I had is now gone." This quote is from a man who lives in the seat of Windermere, who wrote to the Premier in the open letter: "My wife had a diagnosed mental illness and secretly ran a debt through a financial institution in my name. She wasted almost $10,000 and I'm now divorced from her. The various vendors at different pubs and clubs were not interested in helping her and paid lip service to responsible gambling. I could no longer trust her. She said that she felt totally alone whilst being served drinks. No one bothered her. Someone should have. These machines and those that benefit financially, not the punter, are largely responsible for my surrogate debt and the destruction of my marriage." Mr. President, these voices that we hear coming through in these comments that people freely provided just a couple of years ago when they wanted the then Premier, but really all decision makers, to better understand what the picture looks like in this state. President, I'll resume where I was up to in speaking on this motion. I was in the part of the motion that is in fact part D, speaking about the impact of harm caused by poker machine use in Tasmania on other areas of our service systems. And I had noted that we don't have a great deal of data available from the government that makes the links that are there. So I am speaking to the research and what it tells us about these links, and I'm also illustrating that with a range of stories and comments directly from Tasmanian people. So I'm going to pick up where I left off. I'd just been speaking about relationships as an area of difficulty, and that would be something that would tally through to our family support systems, to our family court systems even, to all sorts of areas that we, even child protection, those sorts of areas. I'm going to follow on from the relationship, talking about relationships and the impact there, and I'm going to talk about domestic violence. I'm not going to share stories here. Let me clearly state that the underlying cause of family violence is gender inequality and gender-based discrimination in our culture and our community. And I note that this is a really complex area to discuss, and making claims about factors which contribute to causation is problematic. But what I will do is share with you some research which we have that provides some indication that there is a link between poker machines and domestic violence. National research, which included Tasmania, Janet Patford from Tasmania as a researcher and Tasmanian data, found half of those receiving treatment for problem gambling reported an experience of domestic violence in the previous 12 months, either as survivors or as perpetrators. Half. Research in Victoria, which looked at a 9-year period, found a direct link between the accessibility of poker machines and family violence. This research by Markham found areas with no poker machines had 20% less family violence incidents and 30% less assaults overall, compared to areas with at least 75 poker machines per 10,000 people. So that was the comparison. No poker machines, at least 75 per 10,000 people. I believe that is a similar ratio that we might have statewide in Tasmania. The recommendation from this research from Victoria was for family violence to be considered when licensing decisions are made in relation to poker machines. I believe here in Tasmania we should consider poker machine licences in the context of our state's domestic violence framework. We've devoted a lot of attention and investment and real community focus to addressing domestic violence. I think we should consider reducing accessibility to poker machines through reducing opening hours, for example, reducing the number of machines, perhaps particularly the number of machines or venues concentrated in certain areas. We could remove them entirely from particular suburbs. That would be or from suburbs broadly, which would be my preference, as members well know. We could decide to look at our family violence figures and map them against our poker machine distribution. Perhaps we need to think about reducing access to poker machines in particular areas. What I'm suggesting is that we have an opportunity to consider this in a structured way. That would be, and I think that the best way to do that would actually be to apply the community interest test, which now sits there available to us. We could apply that community interest test to each of the new licences the government proposes to give individual venues in 2023. The government have dismissed this option on no credible grounds, I would suggest. We have a current single licence for operating poker machines which ends in 2023. The new model will mean new licences to be issued. The community interest test is there to be applied to new licences. So every individual licence proposed under the new model, in my view, should have a community interest test applied. It would be within that context that we could consider matters such as domestic violence, but also a whole range of others. And local communities, including local governments and other leadership organisations, could have a role to play then in having input into the granting or otherwise of those licences. I believe that to not apply the community interest tests to the new licences to be given to venues after 2023 would be a further disenfranchisement of the Tasmanian community. It takes away the community's rights to have their voice heard and have a say in the future of what goes on in their local suburb. That's exactly what the community interest test is supposed to be about, giving communities that say. I'm going to move on to housing and finances as an area. Housing and homelessness, really, but it connects to finances, as we well know. Gambling can cost a lot of money, and yet surveys often show more than half of people who gamble did so because of a dream of winning. But for people who develop problems with gambling, there's usually no point in a win. As one man in Tasmania described, my biggest win was about $500 or $600, I think. I didn't spend it that night, but the next morning I was back in the pub. There's no point to a big win because I put it all back in. This man explains further, when I was 21, I had 9 cars, 1 boat, and I owned everything. Now I have absolutely nothing. You do win, you can win, but in the long run, you don't win. It's just a big, big loss. It's common for gambling counsellors to see people after they have got a big payout, and that's described in this Tasmanian woman's story. About 5 years ago, I did $80,000 in 2.5 months. I had just finished work and got a payout. I was taking out $2,000 a day at one stage and couldn't wait to get near a poker machine. An addicted gambler doesn't budget. You are sitting there in a world of your own, on another planet. You would walk out with nothing. Spiralling into debt, Mr. President, is well recorded in the research. Here are two Tasmanian stories I'll read from Anglicare's 2005 report, House of Cards. Ben frequently accessed personal loans and credit card cash advances to pay for his gambling. When he was married and in full-time employment, Ben estimates he spent 20% of his income on gambling. Since his divorce and experiencing a period of unemployment and now casual work, Ben's expenditure on gambling accounts for about 40% of his income. At times he has difficulty paying rent. Ben said, and I quote, "Probably had about 9 personal loans at one time and about 10 credit cards. At a peak time, personal loans were probably about $80,000, credit cards probably about $30,000 to $35,000. Because the creditors were after dollars, my car has been repossessed and my credit cards." Another woman told Anglicare, as well as the depression, because you've got no money to stay there and play, you've got no money to feed the children. You've got no money to buy the medication they need for their asthma or whatever, and you've got no money to pay your rent or electricity bill or telephone or your car registration or whatever. And it's like, what do I do now? How am I going to cover this? Well, maybe if I scrounge a few dollars from your kid's bank account, you can at least buy some bread and milk and they can have toast or whatever. Maybe you've built up a reasonable sort of credit rating. You can go and borrow a couple of $100s and buy your groceries or pay your bill. But then you're still way behind the 8 ball because it still takes you so many months to pay the money back you've borrowed, and you never catch up in your own self-respect, your own mind and your financial situation. You never get that back. Although the data's patchy, it's estimated that at least 10% of the demand for homelessness services is a result of gambling harm. The Productivity Commission estimates that people who do not have a problem with gambling spend less than 2% of their household income on gambling, while people with a gambling problem, spend 22% of their household income on gambling. It's hard enough in this state, as we well know, to pay the rent or a mortgage, let alone when a fifth of your income has already been taken. Mr. President, research by academics from the University of Sheffield have looked at homelessness problems among over 50s. They did a study in Boston, Massachusetts, Melbourne, Australia, and 4 English cities. This was interesting because it revealed patterns of homelessness in over 50s to be quite broadly similar across those 3 separate continents, except in Australia, where it was identified a link between homelessness and gambling that appeared that did not exist in the other study areas involved. Of the 125 homeless people from Australia surveyed as part of that study, 38% mentioned gambling as a cause of their homelessness problems. In England and Massachusetts, in the study, only 4% cited this as a reason. I'm going to speak now about work. It's not hard to imagine that gambling affects people's work. Gambling problems will have a flow-on effect to productivity, to maintaining employment, to gaining employment. In this state, there's an important issue for us to consider. About half the people in gambling counselling report losing time from work or study due to gambling. People could also be at work but not concentrating due to the stress of their gambling losses. A Tasmanian man describes this. I went into hospital with internal bleeding from an ulcer due to the stress of it. Also, when I was working, he mentions his profession, but I'm not going to, my mind wasn't fully on the job, and so I injured myself and spent a week in hospital as a result of that. The thing is, you would have 2 personalities. Like at work, I'd be happy in everything. I was in customer service. You couldn't tell anyone at work. You would hide it all. You wouldn't say anything. You would keep it to yourself. Here in Tasmania, we do not have a good understanding of the impact that poker machine harm is having on our levels of employment, underemployment and productivity. Certainly the fact that an increasing number of Tasmanians are underemployed and would be experiencing stress from that situation places them at a heightened risk of poker machine addiction, as we well know from the research and evidence. I want to talk now about children. It's connected to relationships and to families, but it's also a separate matter for consideration, I think. Again, the Productivity Commission found that for every person with a significant gambling problem, on average 0.6 children are living in the same household. A significant number of participants in the Productivity Commission study spoke about the impact of their parents' gambling on them as children when they experienced a sense of neglect as a consequence of insufficient food or because of family instability due to gambling. And I quote from the Productivity Commission's report: "The most immediate concern for children's welfare in problem gambling households is poverty. Problem gambling eats up resources that otherwise would be spent on all household members, from family entertainment, a serviceable car, a pleasant home, holidays, even food." The following quotes are from an Anglicare study that illustrate this. "Sometimes I go into my daughter's room to get money, but she sleeps with a wallet under her pillow, so I can't get it." Mr. President, you can imagine the shame. This quote makes that shame quite explicit. The kids have gone hungry and gone without, and that's where I've realised that it's not right, and I've left them at home in my house on their own, doors unlocked, so that I can get in quietly when I get home at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning without waking the neighbourhood. I've actually left those children at home where anything could happen to them to go off and gamble. I'm ashamed of that. I'm disgusted with myself that I've done that. But that compulsive need has been there to go out and try and get a little bit extra. Even though I know I'm not going to get that extra money, I'm going to blow it every time. As a result of this, I've lost two things that are very dear to me. The first is my 14-year-old's trust in me because I've gone through her bank account and cleaned it out. She earns her own money, and I'll go into her room when she goes to school and grab every cent I can, and I'm off down to those pokies again. She's frightened now, and when she gets her money, she goes out and spends it on whatever junk she can find because she knows Mum will get it if she doesn't. She can't hide it. She can't take it to school. She's not allowed. And I've lost my own self-respect. I want those things back. I'm finding it very hard to earn those things back, and I'm trying my hardest. Mr. President, that's a really confronting story to hear. That woman was incredibly brave, I think, and vulnerable to share that story. It's tempting, I think, for a lot of people to then blame individuals for the sorts of choices, it appears, that parents might be making in stories like that. What I'm encouraging us to look at is the fact that those choices are made within the context that we set and make available to people in our community. We make these machines available in the community, and we make them available at an intensity that allows people to devastate their lives and their children's lives to that extent. We don't have to do that. We could choose differently for our community, and people, our fellow Tasmanians, would not have to be faced with that situation and those choices when they're experiencing a medically diagnosable addiction. The very last thing I'm going to talk about in this section is crime. Again, there's a dearth of data on this issue in this state. The SEIS did actually look at the effects to some extent of gambling on crime in Tasmania 1 year. It was prompted by Anglicare releasing their research, Nothing Left to Lose. That was in 2010. That Nothing Left to Lose report found, and I'm going to quote this, "Ordinary people are doing things they would not ordinarily do. That is, committing serious crimes because of a gambling problem that leaves them with nothing left to lose." The report looked at 41 cases heard in the Tasmanian Supreme Court over 6 years in the early 2000s. Half of the offenders had no prior convictions. There were numerous statements by judges that the gambling left them nowhere to turn. There was comorbidity with drug and alcohol and mental ill health. The crimes were serious ones. But what I want to raise here is the role gambling addiction and the easy accessibility of poker machines in many cases played. This is not just a cost to the individual. 35 of the 41 cases saw a person get a custodial sentence. Anglicare calculated, I believe at the time, that the cost to the prison system of just those cases was at least $4 million. There were also the uncounted costs for the police time and the court system. 6 of those imprisoned had dependent children. Child protection was then involved. As one judge said in sentencing, in common with so many others who have committed like crimes, you deluded yourself that the next gamble would result in a win that would enable you to repay the money you'd taken. And another judge said, the catalyst for your offending was your gambling. You began with having a social bet. You were feeling pressure at work and became depressed. Your rate of gambling increased. You were using it as a stress reliever. Your gambling spiralled out of control and you began to steal to cover the addiction. The stealing escalated over time. You used significant parts of your income on gambling and additionally borrowed large amounts which were also lost. Mr. President, most of us will recognise elements there we've already talked about today in a typical experience of gambling harm, something that begins with non-harmful behaviour, but because of the nature of the machines becomes harmful behaviour, both through their accessibility and the features that actually allow people to become addicted. The fact that we allow those machines to take so much money so quickly. The Productivity Commission warned us, in fact, that faced with mounting financial difficulties and gambling-related debts, when all these legal sources of gambling funds are exhausted, problem gamblers may then resort to illegal activities to obtain money. It's right there for us to consider when we're making public policy on this product. It's difficult to estimate the number of people with a gambling problem who are committing crimes relating to their gambling, as many people don't admit it, and we don't generally ask them to reveal it in court. South Australia is an interesting situation. There, they've recognised the very tangible connection between gambling and crime, and they have introduced actually a gambling intervention program court. It's one of their therapeutic jurisprudence approaches in their court system. We have some of those here in our state. We don't have one that focuses on gambling. However, in South Australia, they introduced that program. It provides the opportunity for somebody who has committed a crime that was related to their gambling problem to engage with monitored assistance and behavioural change programs. The participant must attend court regularly, and the magistrate reviews their progress and encourages the participant to keep heading in the right direction and warns them if they don't, they may then well go to a custodial sentence. All types of gambling are treated through this court. The program provides support and case management, access to services such as housing and financial, employment and relationship counselling. I'm looking at an article that was written 2 years after the court was established by one of the magistrates, and the magistrate observes that over the past 2 years only 2 participants have failed to complete the program successfully. And much of the success has been attributed to the one-on-one therapy and the support that's provided in a range of ways. He notes, I think quite rightly, that South Australia can be proud of having the first and only gambling intervention program court, that it is helping save individuals and families and to prevent reoffending. Now, I'm certain that South Australia is far from perfect in preventing and minimising harm from poker machines. I suspect they are much like here and other states in the eastern seaboard, where the industry is just as politically influential and powerful. But the establishment of this court is at least a clear acknowledgement of the connection between gambling harm and the social issues. And it's an acknowledgement of the broader cost of that harm. Clearly, if we focus on first principles, it's better to avoid a problem rather than manage it after the fact. So effective and compassionate intervention programs are to be applauded, but it's a failure of good policy making to neglect to first fully implement the suite of straightforward, evidence-based, expert-advised prevention measures that we may know to be available. I know that many of the stories and voices I've shared in this time today have been shocking, and some of them have been very sad. I shared them so that in the discussion, we aren't to lose sight of the real lives and experiences of Tasmanians that sit at the heart of this issue. We're encouraged to think by industry of these poker machines as harmless entertainment. The industry has even equated them to a trip to the movies and an ice cream. That was in the context of the parliamentary inquiry. Others may remember that. But we can categorically say that poker machines are a dangerous product. They're regarded that way globally. They're a product that puts health and families and livelihoods and lives at risk. Legislators tasked to establish appropriate policy and regulation of this product, such as we are, how can we, on the one hand, support government investment in health, mental health, suicide prevention, family violence, law and order and employment services and support, and on the other hand, neglect to make every available effort to reduce the risk of harm and the severity of harm that pokies cause to Tasmanian families? In future, when we look back at these neglected opportunities that we've had to reduce harm caused by this product, I think we will do that in the same way that we look back now at the lax and ill-informed regulation on cigarettes in decades past. Except we should have learned a valuable lesson from our experience with cigarettes. We should have learned that big industry operators gaining super profits from an addictive product will go to great trouble and expense to block effective regulation of their product. We should have learned that governments must actively and transparently resist the influence, political and financial, of those big industry operators. But it looks to me like we haven't learned those lessons. I think we will look back at this hand-in-glove relationship between poker machine industry and the Tasmanian government that we've seen for many years with horror and incredulity. In fact, I believe that most Tasmanians already do. In this Parliament, this chamber, if we allow in 2020 yet another opportunity to be foregone for Tasmanians to step away from the tainted influence of a destructive poker machine industry, quite frankly, shame on all of us. This is a product that will never be on the right side of history, but each of us here can be. I'm going to move on, Mr. President, to the next part of my motion. It's point I, which talks about, it's under section E, point I, which talks about data, and it talks about at least 23,000 Tasmanians in at-risk groups. Now, first I need to make a correction. I apologise to members. When I wrote my motion last year, I had not yet updated my calculations and my go-to numbers from the most recent SEIS and census figures. I apologise for that. It means my figure of at least 23,000 Tasmanians in at-risk groups is a little out. Unfortunately, with the newer figures, the number's actually higher. This is because it's a prevalence across the whole population, and our population has grown, and because the prevalence for both problem gambling and low risk has also increased between 2014 and 2017. What we've seen is the estimated number of Tasmanians in at-risk groups sitting now at almost 27,000 people. Tasmanian people. This consists of about 2,300 problem gamblers, 5,400 moderate risk gamblers, and a whopping 19,000 Tasmanians who are currently called low risk gamblers. We'll talk more about those categories in a moment. What's worrying for me, and I think it should be worrying for the government also, is that the prevalence for the total of these three at-risk groups has actually increased since the 2014 survey. The prevalence for the most extreme category, problem gambling, has also increased since 2014. Well, I would say that this is not an indication of a successful approach to harm minimisation. Even if those numbers were to stay steady, I would make the case that this is not an indication of a successful approach to harm minimisation. Mr. President, despite empty government claims of national best practice harm minimisation, what we are doing currently is not working. If by working, that is, we mean actually reducing harm caused to Tasmanian people. This government appears content to benchmark us against the devastating failure of harm minimisation that we see in other Australian states. Bizarrely, they regularly trumpet this fact that we are the best of this appallingly bad, globally worst lot. For a start, they can only make this claim by pretending that Western Australia doesn't exist. And I challenge the government to back its claim of best practice and prove how and where its harm minimisation efforts have actually led to a reduction of harm in our state. Prove that your approach is working. Make the case. Explain to us why you are content to enable the continuation of increasing levels of problem and at-risk gambling in Tasmania. Make that case. And as I know you will roll out that trite line that Tasmania has nationally best practice harm minimisation, I challenge you to add the next line of your argument and then add the line after that. And that one should explain to us with meaningful evidence how your lack of action on proven evidence-informed advice amounts to best practice. Make your case. Make it to the Tasmanian people who you disrespect with sound bites to hide policy failure. I'm going to return to prevalence now, Mr. President, and the way we try to put a number to these at-risk groups, because that's what we're looking at in the motion here. I'm going to clarify what the at-risk groups mean in the course of that, so we're clear as we talk about the numbers what we mean by them. The SEIS provides this information. It says that both moderate risk and problem gamblers are more likely to use a poker machine in a pub or club than in a casino, for example. It tells us they're likely to gamble 150 times a year. That's 3 times a week. But what is also of serious consideration for public policy are that those categorised as low-risk gamblers. Low risk is perhaps a misleading description for this category. Despite how it may sound, it does not mean that they are at low risk of a problem. It means that they are already experiencing issues with their gambling, but the severity of those issues is so far comparatively low with, say, problem gambling. Every person in the category that's called low risk has some concern about their gambling. They might articulate feelings of guilt, or they might say they find it hard to stop. But they're not yet gambling 3 times a week. Their gambling has not yet become uncontrollable. To give you an indication, this low-risk group is described by the SEIS as people who spend about the same on gambling in a year as a typical Tasmanian household does on electricity. I've got to talk a little bit about 1 in 3. It's under the second point there. It's under that point, the same point in the motion, where it says that 1 in 3 Tasmanians personally knows someone who has a serious problem gambling on poker machines. It's hard to imagine that we wouldn't set an explicit goal for ourselves to reduce the prevalence and impact of gambling harm in Tasmania, especially when, from that 2016 survey that was conducted of 1,000 people around our state, did find that 1 in 3 Tasmanians personally knew someone with a serious problem on poker machines. I know that's what the survey showed because I commissioned it. It was an independent survey undertaken by EMRS, and we did it because for decades we'd been doing surveys that showed at least 80% of people didn't feel that poker machines contributed positively to their community and wanted to remove them or reduce them. We had that figure, we used that figure, and it was becoming a tired figure, and I wondered what else could we find out that might give us more of an indication about how many Tasmanians are affected. So we surveyed, and what we found was this. 1 in 3 of us personally knows someone. 1 in 3. I'll give you some examples of those 1 in 3. This one is from a woman who lives in the seat of Rosevears. She wrote, and this is all in the open letter that was sent to the Premier in 2017. She wrote, "I know firsthand the trauma wrought by pokies. My husband drained our joint bank account before his death in September. I urge you to remove this scourge from our communities. A man who lives in the seat of Elwick wrote, "My mother has some dementia and lives in a unit in Glenorchy. All she wants to do is go to the Elwick Hotel and lash out on the machines. We cannot stop her, and she is very determined to go there as much as possible. Her excuse is she needs something to do, but she will not accept help from Veterans Affairs. Get rid of the machines, as most people that go to these hotels, the elderly seem to outnumber the younger people." And then a woman who actually is from the seat of Windermere expressed some fear for her mother. She wrote, "My mother took up playing poker machines in her late 70s. The clubs were very happy to have her visits and her money. She possibly had early signs of dementia, and for that reason her gambling was out of control. She lost a lot of money and did not seem to care. For family members who had to watch this behaviour, it was terrifying." Perhaps the first time her mother went to play pokies, we might have thought of her as one of our apocryphal nanas who want to have a flutter with their $20. As this lady demonstrates, there's no way to know what will come from a simple flutter for Nana or for anyone else that sits down in front of these machines. And from the seat of Murchison, we had a man write in terms of his sister. "After 20 years of problem gambling, my sister committed suicide by overdosing on prescription medication she had become addicted to. In the final 20 years of her life, she was in and out of jail on fraud and other related charges. She was desperate to feed her habit." And also in Murchison, a woman wrote, "I watch my father blow his age pension every fortnight on the pokies. I supply the food and cook his meal every meal, so I know that he at least eats every day. He can't afford to fuel his car up. He struggles to pay his car registration. A brother pays his vehicle insurance and another brother pays his house and contents insurance. Pokies are a trap and need to be limited or removed from a lot of areas." These are the messages that show us what that 1 in 3 looks like. They come from our people in our communities. 1 in 3 Tasmanians. I think that these Tasmanians are the people whose voices need to be heard when we are talking about regulating in the best interests of our state. I'm going to talk about the figure of 79%, which is 0.3 under item E in my motion. 79% of Tasmanian gamblers help clients have poker machines as their primary form of gambling. We don't have to spend too much time on this. It's a straightforward figure. Gambling Support collects data from gambling help services, including the reasons people are there to seek help. 79% of the Tasmanian people seeking help are harmed by pokies. It's interesting because although we have numbers like that and they're from here locally, they tell us exactly what's happening here in our community, there is still this perception that persists that things like sports betting or online gambling are huge problems and should take our attention. But the reality is that at this time, the numbers tell us it's still poker machines in this state that are the clear and present danger and causing the most damage. Also, unlike sports betting and online gambling, the licensing and the regulation of poker machines is a matter for state parliaments. It's a matter for us to determine, to regulate and to make decisions for our community. So while we are, I think, quite naturally wondering about the development of new technologies with gambling, and we are right to be concerned about increases that may occur in those forms, this need not and should not serve to divert us from our important responsibility when it comes to poker machines. I think we can walk and chew gum on this, and it's particularly important that we don't put aside our responsibility and our role when it comes to poker machines, because that's where we can make a tangible difference. Without fail, every time the issue of poker machines is discussed, and I've discussed it with thousands of Tasmanians over the last 5 years, I can guarantee you that somebody will raise the matter of other forms of gambling. And it's something that there's a lot of misconception about. I think often the assertion that's made that I engage with people about is that if we were to take away people's access to poker machines, they would transfer their problem to another form of gambling. It's a really commonly imagined scenario. And I want to be clear here on the record that research tells us that that is a false perception. It's actually a wrong thinking. That's not what research tells us happens. Poker machine addiction, problem gambling on poker machines, is a very particular dynamic. We talked about it earlier. It's to do with the design of the machines, the features that create the moment of anticipation, and all those other things. Research has looked into whether that same effect or that same thing that people seek from that addiction would be replicated in other forms and encourage them to move to them. So far, the research tells us no. I think this is often used as a bit of a red herring argument by industry and perhaps by others who are pursuing their own interests. It's often, though, just a genuine question from people out there in the community, and I think it's one that's worth clearing up. But what I'd like to do is come back to the data. So the 79%. We know only 1 in 10 people actually seek help. So even if we're looking at people in our gambling support programs, which that figure does, we're not capturing everybody who's harmed by gambling or poker machine gambling out there. There's a lot of people who need help who are not actually seeking that help yet. And I think that the hidden nature of this problem is difficult for us. It makes it difficult for us to discuss it. It makes it difficult for voices of those who are affected to be heard. There's 2 things I know about this from working at Anglicare and interacting with frontline services and the workers who are there, who are really engaged with this issue in a very tangible way in the people that they assist and support. The first thing, or one of the first things I really learnt quite clearly talking to frontline workers is that for people seeking help, it's incredibly hard for them. They pretty much have to hit rock bottom before they're able to then come and seek help. And then the process of managing an addiction is incredibly hard. Those counsellors and support workers who assist people to do that are doing a wonderful job, and they are very skilled at what they do. But for the person themselves, it's a daily struggle. It's a daily struggle to be climbing that mountain of addiction and facing up to the difficulty every day of not using poker machines. When they have to be in a local community where those machines are placed everywhere, it's particularly difficult. Addicted people to poker machines will tell you that they fall asleep hearing pokies jingles and they wake up hearing pokies jingles. And even those people who are in Risdon prison who've had a pokies addiction will tell you that continues throughout the time that they're serving their time in prison. The second thing that I learnt from frontline workers is a little bit harder to describe. I'm going to try and really summarise it effectively. I find it quite fascinating. Workers develop relationship with the people that they help. Anglicare has all sorts of services, so apart from gambling support, all sorts of other social services. And workers in all those other social services talk about when you form a relationship and develop trust between the person that you're assisting and the worker, all sorts of things over time begin to be disclosed. And people may disclose things such as mental illness quite readily now. We've normalised that really quite well in our community conversations. Family violence is coming to be disclosed, I am given to understand, more readily now too. We're also quite proactively working as a community around the way that we talk about and support that. Workers will talk about people disclosing drug and alcohol issues, and that's a challenging thing to disclose, but we frame them as a health problem now and we offer support in a non-judgmental way around that. The anecdotal stories that I heard from workers more than once is that the very deepest thing that gets disclosed after building trust and after time spent assisting and supporting, the very deepest buried thing is a poker machine addiction. It's a pokies addiction that has the most shame, that sits buried and hidden the most deeply for people who are experiencing it as a problem, and not just for the person who may have the problem, but for their family members, They might be coming for financial counselling because they haven't got any money left to pay the bills, so they need help to figure out what they're going to do with their budget. Family members who are affected by the issue but still feel the shame of it. Now, I find this really fascinating and I have no research to explain it at all. I'd be really keen to see it. The best I can do is probably speculate a little around it, and I do speculate about whether there's a connection to the way we talk about these issues in public, the way we have our public messaging about them and what that means in terms of what we say to the people who are affected by them. I think we've done really increasingly well on those other issues I mentioned in improving our public conversation. And then I think about our public messaging about poker machines and about poker machine addiction. And the first things that come into my mind, and I'm not sure if what comes into yours, is things like Gamble Responsibly and Responsible Gambling Week and Know Your Odds and so on. In each of those cases, the framing of our public messaging makes the person the problem. Even Know Your Odds, because if you didn't know your odds, then it's your fault. Certainly, Gamble Responsibly makes it your fault. It implies that you have an issue with that activity and it's the result of a personal failing. Responsible gambling. I think that's a really important concept. I believe it's really important and possible for us to legislate and regulate gambling responsibly. I think the responsibility element is important for us to attach to our role. I think it's also really important to attach it to the role of those people who are providing gambling services, the operators. I think responsible service of gambling, responsible operation of gambling is a really important concept to talk about. But if I had a gambling addiction and I'd been told it was my fault for not being responsible, I think I'd have a pretty huge amount of shame, and I'd probably want to keep it pretty hidden too. That's just my speculation on that phenomenon. But speaking about providing gambling services responsibly, and again perhaps tying into this issue around hidden and shame, I want to say something about the visibility of a gambling problem. I mean, no doubt that staff in pokies pubs know who is having a problem. They know because the person is like that white mouse we talked about earlier and their dopamine hit button. The person who has a problem with gambling comes in every day. They're there before the place opens in the morning. They don't stop to eat or drink. They don't go to the toilet. They don't show any satisfaction from a win and just put the win back into the machine and keep going till it's all gone. I think staff know that the people they see exhibiting those behaviours, and then they see it again the next day when they come back, and the next day after that, I think those staff can tell that those people have got a problem. One Tasmanian describes it really well. This is what they say. We would arrive at 10 o'clock and go home about 4 or 5 p.m. Sometimes we would play pokies for 5 to 7 hours. Depends on how much money we had. We didn't even eat or drink tea or coffee or alcohol. I don't drink. The majority of them sit there for hours. And another woman says, no, we wouldn't even go to the toilet. We would have kept playing the pokies if we'd sold things in our houses to get the money. And a man describes spending many hours at the venue. I've been there when it opens at 9 a.m. and there until it closes at night. I just keep on going back. The venues where these people, those voices, where they were gambling, should have noticed them. They should have intervened. Another man who chased his losses would go to gaming venues as often as he could, sometimes 3 times a day. He would drink the occasional glass of water but never eat, and he would try to last up to 4 hours without going to the toilet. When he was skipping work, this man would stay at the venue for only a short time. However, he was often surprised by how long he was at the venue for. This is what he says. I would play until my fingers got sore. You think you've worked out the system because you're watching them for so long, but that's absolute rubbish. I could do up to $400 in one session, but then I'd have to stop because I would be physically exhausted. You think you would have been there for 30 minutes, but you have been there for about 3 or 4 hours. It's really strange. In all of those stories, there were venue staff who could see what was going on. If these patrons had staggered to the bar and slurringly asked for a drink, they wouldn't have been served. Yet what those venue staff were seeing every day was the gambling equivalent of intoxication. Currently, we do not effectively hold venues to account for responsible service of gambling. We give it lip service, it's part of training, it's there in the mandatory code, it's supposed to happen. But when you hear stories like that, and we could go out right now and hear stories like that all over this state attached to every venue, when you hear those stories, you know it's not working. We're not holding them accountable enough. When it can be seen so very clearly. We come to the final data point on that point E, in the motion. This is the shortest one yet. 40 to 60% of the money taken by pokies comes from people who've got a problem. It's now well accepted that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the losses come from people who are at-risk gamblers. The Productivity Commission, our Tasmanian SEIS and our Gaming Commission don't question the fact. So let's take it as a given. One thing we can note, though, is that half the money, let's say about half, since it's 40 to 60%, somewhere around half the money going into machines is coming from a cohort of people who are addicted to the machines, the ones that make the most, and they are the ones that make the most money for the gambling businesses. They are the star customers. They are the ones who aren't eating and drinking. They are the ones who aren't going to the toilet. They're the ones who are there at 9 a.m. and still there at 2 a.m. maybe. They're the ones who are not being provided with gambling services responsibly. Moving on to point F in the motion, the SEIS, we talked a little earlier about prevalence studies, and now I'll explain a bit more about their limitations. I'm not an expert in correct methodology and I make no recommendations about this. My main concern is that given their known limitations, the government continues to misrepresent findings from our prevalence studies, and I just would like to correct the record on that. Every 3 years, the Tasmanian government funds a social and economic impact study into gambling in our state. The SEIS involves a phone survey, the prevalence part of it, involves a phone survey to landline and mobile phone numbers. The survey takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete, and you could expect that the more you gamble, the longer you're probably going to be doing the survey because you'll have more details to provide. So how accurate are the prevalence surveys? Well, they're self-reported data, so that's immediately going to present some challenges. Sarah Hare from Queensland's Schottler Consulting is a well-regarded prevalence study expert. She was actually in Hobart last year for the National Association of Gambling Studies conference, and she participated in a discussion about prevalence studies. Now, Sarah Hare earns money consulting doing these prevalence studies. She certainly wasn't suggesting they're no value at all. But what she did say, which has relevance for Tasmania to consider, is that self-reported data is very inaccurate. These surveys ask people to estimate the amount of time and the amount of money they spent gambling in the past year. They need the respondent to provide that information across all sorts of gambling in our gambling prevalence study: pokies, races, keno, lotteries. Now, I don't gamble, so for me to gauge what it would be like to respond to such a survey is problematic. I'd have to replace it with something I could relate to more easily. So I would replace it with, say, something like my alcohol consumption. You can imagine along with me, if you like, that if we were doing a prevalence survey about alcohol consumption, these are just some of the indicative questions that would look like the gambling one that we might have to answer in that survey. We'd have to answer, how often in the past year have you had an alcoholic drink? How many times did you drink each week? How many times did you drink at home? How many times did you drink in a pub? How many times did you drink at a restaurant? How many drinks would you usually have each time at each of those locations? How much did you usually spend each time? They're just indicative questions. I don't know the exact format of the questions in our gambling survey, but it'll be something like that, so we know where people gambled, how often they gambled at each of those places and how much they spent. That's what gets presented to us in the SEIS. Now, as I ran through those questions, I don't know if you were thinking along with me, but I don't know, what did you think about how you go with accuracy on the questions? Now, personally, I'd be challenged on 2 fronts. One would be remembering, but the other one is that I know I get squirmy when my GP asks me to estimate my weekly alcohol consumption. But if I had to answer those detailed questions, I'd be pretty far off the mark. In addition to the questions like those, in gambling surveys there are also screening questions for problem gambling. So things like, how often have you felt guilty about your gambling? And how often have you borrowed money for your gambling? From all the answers, the survey then categorises each respondent as a non-gambler, a non-problem gambler, and one of the 3 at-risk groups. So we'd fall into one of those categories. Now ask yourself, if you did have a problem with gambling, how relaxed do you think you'd feel during those 20 minutes or so while a stranger asks you those questions? Mr. President, I don't know about you, but I think I'd feel relatively uncomfortable. Sarah Hare, the prevalence expert, agreed with the premise at that conference session last year that it's highly likely that a problem gambler would get distressed and could hang up or refuse to answer questions. When the Tasmanian survey for the 2017 SEIS was conducted, the same number of people that were ultimately found to be problem gamblers hung up. We don't know why they hung up. It could have been anything. They might not have had time to do the survey. It could have been that they had gambling problems. We won't know. And those people who hung up won't be represented in the data necessarily. We could have missed out on the experience of many people who do have a serious gambling problem because answering a phone survey is just too hard for them. So again, the accuracy of the information on the experiences of problem gamblers is very likely to be underreported. Now, the SEIS makes it clear that these limitations are there and that the figures are underestimates. That's good. Every time we use those SEIS figures, we should remember those limitations. We should see them as, at best, a minimum indication for problem gambling, not a maximum. So when the government, for many years now, has been talking about the tiny percentage of Tasmanians who are harmed by gambling and relate that to the SEIS figure of 0.6% of people being problem gamblers, I think they should be honest about their own government's funded research and say, even just to be slightly more accurate, that it is at least 0.6% of Tasmanians that are problem gamblers. Even that small tweak to language would represent more honesty from the government on those figures. In fact, there's a different way, and it's an interesting one, that we could get an indication of how much of an underestimate it might be in these SEIS figures. We can look at self-reported spend on poker machines in the SIS and we can compare or see how that compares to what we know is the actual losses. When people said they spent, what people said they spent when asked on the survey versus what we know was spent in the same time period. We can extrapolate out from the survey and then compare the 2 figures. Probably a little bit back of the envelope, but we've given it a crack. We can get the real figures from the Liquor and Gaming Branch's monthly reports and the Gaming Commission's annual report, so we've got that. So if we extrapolate out from the self-reported spend in the SEIS, we find that it's just about 28% of the actual losses that we know occurred in the same time period. 28%. It's a pretty big underestimation of the spend. It's just giving us a flavour, I guess, of accuracy. Unfortunately, while the SEIS does admit their limitations, they don't adjust for the underrepresentation. So based on the self-reported figure, the SEIS comes up with a figure that's substantially lower for average losses for Tasmanians than the actual figure. SEIS says about $655 per person. Actually, it's probably well over $2,000. It's a huge difference. Particularly interesting, though, was that when you looked at different forms of gambling where the information was collected in the SEIS, there wasn't the same underestimation from other forms. It turns out that in answering questions about Keno, survey respondents' self-reported spend was pretty close to the actual total spend for Keno. It was actually 92% of the actual total, pretty close, compared to the pokies estimate, which was just 28%. I wonder if there's a connection there to that element of shame that I spoke about earlier. Shame at how much money might be being spent. Or perhaps it's more of a link to that experience of losing track of time and awareness that we heard described by some of those addicted gamblers. I'm going to skip ahead, excuse me while I just move through. I think we should actually always admit to ourselves that we've got limited accuracy to the data of exactly who is being harmed in those prevalence figures. I think if we admit that there's a limitation there, we take it as indicating a certain thing, we acknowledge the underestimation, and we believe that it should be higher. I think it would be good to have a clearer picture. I think if we collected information in association with those other services we talked about earlier, and where the people accessing those services or our service systems also had issues or matters relating to poker machines affecting them, we would actually find that filled out our picture too. There's all kinds of ways we could get a picture of what's going on there. I'd like to see that set as a goal going forward, that we find tangible and meaningful ways to better paint that picture for ourselves, both as legislators and regulators, but also just on behalf of the community so that we know what's going on out there. The next point in the motion talks about employment. I put this one in here because it was such a matter of discussion. It was such a contentious issue at different times as we've discussed the issue over the past few years, particularly in the context of the 2018 election campaign. And it's one that really heightens feelings, I suppose, around this issue. Anglicare's submission to the Parliamentary Inquiry in 2017 made this point. The Productivity Commission found, this is a quote, the Productivity Commission found that the impact of the gambling industry on employment is neutral, because if the gambling industry did not exist or was smaller, money would be spent in other industries where employment would be created. So we could literally take the gambling industry away and the reallocated spending would create the same or more jobs elsewhere that would replace the ones that may disappear. This was also reinforced in the work of Professor John Mangan. He was an independent economist who provided an independent economic analysis of taking poker machines out of Tasmanian hotels and clubs. That was also provided to the committee in 2017. That report from John Mangan actually found that there would be a net gain of potentially hundreds of jobs to our state if we were to take poker machines out of pubs and clubs. Even his most pessimistically modelled scenarios showed net job creation for our state. So I want to take this opportunity to make it quite clear that pokies create no more employment than would otherwise be replaced by gambling money spent elsewhere in the economy. In fact, the money spent elsewhere would likely give us more employment, more bang for our buck. Victorian research tells us that for every $1 million spent on poker machines, only 3 jobs are created. For every $1 million spent on beverage services, 8 jobs are created. For every $1 million spent on food service, 20 jobs are created. So we can see that in other key parts of the hotel business and the broader hospitality industry, they are much larger drivers of employment than poker machines. The state government's SEIS, economics professor John Mangan, the local independent economist John Lawrence from the northwest of this state, academic news sites that reviewed this, like The Conversation and also the RMIT ABC Fact Check, they all concur on the actual number of jobs in Tasmania that relate to poker machines. So despite all the claims that might be out there and the figures that fly around, all those sources, all of them independent, concur. They all say there's about 240 full-time equivalent jobs as a result of poker machines in hotels and clubs in Tasmania. That's a little more than, a bit over 2 full-time equivalents probably on average for each of the pubs and clubs, but that wouldn't be evenly spread. Now, Mr. President, these are important jobs. These are important jobs for those who have them, of course. But it's agreed by all those independent sources, and it's confirmed by the Productivity Commission's findings, that even if poker machines were removed from pubs and clubs in Tasmania, these 240 jobs would not likely be lost, because the venues would restructure their business and in doing so retain or create additional jobs. And then if you wanted to start talking about peripheral jobs as somehow being attached to pokies in pubs, people like the cleaners or the delivery drivers, the suppliers, I would point you to the fact that something in the vicinity of 74% of the pubs in Tasmania do not have pokies. Presumably those 74% of pubs also sustain those very same peripheral jobs. And if the pokies pubs no longer had pokies and had to restructure their business, perhaps to a model more like the other 74%, then they would still support those same peripheral jobs without pokies. But when a major party took the policy to remove poker machines from pubs and clubs to the 2018 election, we saw how the poker machine industry responded. And it was all pretty much centred around this issue of jobs. I'm going to use the words of Dr. James Boyce to talk about what happened in that campaign in relation to jobs. And I'm going to quote from a recently released paper James has prepared as something of an update, I guess, a final chapter, if you will, to his award-winning book Losing Streak. I understand that James has sent this paper to all parliamentarians, so I know that he's more than happy for people to see it, to share it, and for anyone who's interested to interact with him about it. I commend the paper to all Tasmanians, actually. On this topic, Dr. Boyce brings his historian's eye, his scrupulous research and his extensive knowledge of the subject to bear. So let me share from that paper. It's page 29, and it's under the heading, The 2018 Election Campaign, a Mandate for Change. James writes, the Liberal Party election policy opened with a line adapted from the Love Your Local campaign, which is funded by the large poker machine hotels and Federal Group. That line was, the gaming machine industry estimated that around 5,000 jobs are at risk if electronic gaming machines are removed from pubs and clubs. This employment forecast was repeated by the Treasurer during the election campaign. The Liberal claim was radically different from the findings of the Social and Economic Impact Study, funded by the government itself, that was released prior to when the Liberal policy had been. The SEIS was publicly released in early January 2018, but was available to the government since before Christmas. This found that there are an estimated 240 FTEs employed relating to EGM operation in hotels and clubs. The Liberal claim was also fact-checked by the ABC RMIT fact-checking unit and found to be false. I continue to quote from the paper from James Boyce. This was not surprising given that it included every job in the Federal Group and large pubs, only a small minority of which had anything to do with poker machines and many of which would benefit from their withdrawal. Thus, for example, every job in the casino was assumed to be impacted, even though the casinos would have a monopoly of poker machines in Tasmania if they were taken out of hotels. The only possible consequence of the ALP giving the casinos a monopoly on poker machines was that poker machine profits would substantially increase in casinos. Just how jobs at the $2,000 a night Sapphire or other high-end hotels such as Henry Jones and Mac 1, let alone Federal Group's transport company, were to be negatively impacted by a policy on poker machines was also not explained. Beecher Townsend from Font PR that developed the campaign told the fact-check unit that the employment claims were based on a survey he undertook in which he asked pubs and clubs with poker machines what impact on jobs would be if poker machines were withdrawn. Every expert consulted by the fact-check unit, as well as everyone who commented on the issue publicly, condemned this patently self-serving methodology. Mr Townsend claimed to the fact-check unit that he resorted to the survey in the absence of other data. In fact, the ABS publishes data on this specific question. Furthermore, by legislation, every 3 years Tasmania undertakes a social and economic impact study on gambling. A number of these have addressed this question, not just the most recent one referred to above. All had direct or indirect employment figures in the gambling industry, dramatically below the figure suggested. Even more disturbing is that despite the magnitude of the lies told by the poker machine industry, the stated Liberal Party policy and the Treasurer's commentary during the campaign went beyond even the industry itself, what the industry itself claimed. The Liberals claimed that around 5,000 jobs were at risk. Even the gambling industry only suggested that this number of jobs would be impacted. During the fact-check investigation, Beecher Townsend from Font PR admitted that the claim that 5,100 jobs were at risk was incorrect. Yet this was the very claim made by the Liberal Party and the Treasurer. In going beyond even the outlandish claims made by the poker machine industry itself, the Liberal Party and Peter Gutwein clearly misled the Tasmanian people. The grossly exaggerated employment claims were made after the latest facts were available to the government through the release of the SEIS. Even after the mistake was highlighted and the fact-check unit had interviewed Beecher Townsend, the Treasurer made no attempt to correct the record. The Liberals' policy continued to clearly state and be aggressively sold to the Tasmanian people on the basis that 5,000 jobs were at risk unless poker machines remained in hotels. Since the SIS, the authoritative report meant to guide policy which the government itself paid for and commissioned, left no doubt that this was incorrect, and the Treasurer refused to amend his position even after the PR firm that invented the 5,100 jobs impacted claim acknowledged these jobs were not at risk. The Liberal Party cannot be said to have had a mandate for the poker machine policy. A mandate is always conditional on accurate policy information being provided to voters. I'm going to end that section there from the paper from James Boyce. Although James does go on to point out that that wasn't the only inaccuracy or potential lie that was provided during that election campaign. There were also claims that were put on Federal Group website which claimed that just 24% of gambling expenditure in Tasmania occurred via EGMs in financial year 16, whereas the true figure is actually 58.6%. Claims were made that we have less pokies per capita than all other Australian states. We actually have more than Victoria and about the national average when you take out New South Wales as the outlier, the saturation that's there. And the other thing, of course, was that we had a repetition there as well about that prevalence matter, that misrepresenting the prevalence figure, that 99.4% of Tasmanian adults are not problem gamblers. Now, we know that that's not true. We know that at least 0.6% are problem gamblers, at least. We certainly don't know that 99.4% are not. I think that the self-serving, deliberate lies told by both the industry and the Liberal Party during that 2018 election campaign are actually a disgrace, but they're really a tragedy. To take the issue of jobs in this state, to twist it through lies and fear-mongering into a weapon, is nothing but the basis to political opportunism, in my view. All of us here know that jobs are a real sore point. There are vulnerability in this state. Far too many Tasmanians are either out of work or are underemployed or in insecure work. Perhaps particularly in the poker machine industry. Many Tasmanians already feel worried about their jobs. Tasmanians working in pokies, pubs and clubs and working in the casino were flat out lied to and manipulated by their employer and by the Liberal government. Even Tasmanians working in other companies that do business with those pubs, clubs and casinos were lied to, told their livelihoods were also at risk. In fact, I know for a fact, Mr President, that this very month, still, Federal Group are telling suppliers and associated businesses that they should feel scared for their business if the government's pokies policy doesn't go through. And while this continues to be a despicable lie, we can in some sense understand a private business attempting at all costs and by any means to hang on to the lucrative super profits it's become accustomed to. I would say that the true dishonour here is in what took place with the Liberal Party, their base betrayal of the Tasmanian people and of our democratic foundation, which are now indelible stains on the annals of our state. Come to the final part of my motion, Mr President, about the modelling. It's a call, really, part G and then number 2, sit together. I'll speak to them briefly. To date, G says, to date the Tasmanian Government has not released and made available for public scrutiny and discussion modelling on the social and economic impact of the proposed new poker machine licensing arrangement to be introduced to Tasmania in 2023. And then that flows on to point 2 of the motion, which says the Legislative Council calls on the Tasmanian Government to undertake publicly release modelling on the social and economic impact of the proposed new poker machine licensing arrangements to be introduced in Tasmania in 2023. Late last year, when I tabled this motion, there was very little information about the proposed new model. All we had were a few pages. from the Liberal government election policy, which was essentially identical to the THA federal group proposal tabled at the parliamentary inquiry in 2017. Just a couple of weeks ago, we've seen the government release a consultation paper on its regulatory framework, which is based on its policy. Submissions, in fact, close tomorrow on that paper. The material that is presented to us for consideration in the government's consultation paper include still no modelling or evidence of the likely social or economic impacts of this licensing model and regulatory framework on the Tasmanian poker machine industry, on the broader Tasmanian hospitality industry, on the Tasmanian community, or on the Tasmanian economy overall. None of that is discussed, presented or alluded to. The consultation paper has no references to sources of evidence, data or research that may have informed the material it presents or supports the decisions made on the policy and regulatory elements that are there. No indication is given in this paper of the process that was used to develop first the policy and now this regulatory framework. It doesn't mention any role played by key stakeholders who might have been involved or consulted. We don't know, for example, from this consultation paper, whether all parts of the poker machine industry in the state actually know what's in it, understand what's in it and endorse it. We don't know that, actually. It doesn't say that. Consultation questions are absent from the consultation paper. Doesn't give us any, without consultation questions, gives us no indication of where input from the public or from other key stakeholders might actually have an opportunity to inform or shape or change what's there. And it certainly doesn't present any overall cost-benefit analysis for the state of the proposed changes under the licensing model. Given these deficiencies, the value, and I would suggest even the authenticity of this consultation process is in question. Mr President, in regards to the Gutwein Government's policy, which the framework is the paper seeks to give effect to, the consultation paper explicitly states matters specific to the government's policy itself are out of scope of this consultation process. Now, I note in a Mercury newspaper article yesterday, the leader of this place is quoted as saying, and I quote, "We have now taken details of our proposed future gaming markets reform out to the community for open consultation, which is ongoing. Even Ms Webb is welcome to make a submission." Now, I'd first like to thank the leader for that invitation, that even I may make a submission. The leader, I think, will be pleased to hear that I have indeed prepared one. In it, I raise over 50 unanswered questions on the material presented and omitted by the Gutwein Government in that consultation paper. I'll be making that submission tomorrow. I would also like to take this opportunity to correct the leader on what she said in her media statement. The government's policy on future gaming market reforms has not, at any stage, been taken to the community for open consultation. It has never been subjected to appropriate scrutiny, assessment and public examination. To date, there have been no details made public on the policy's development process, nor the evidence base that informs it, nor the social and economic modelling that underpins it, or even on the real policy objectives in detail that it aims to achieve. Let's remind ourselves how we've arrived at this moment, because I think we've skipped some steps, Mr President. Exactly 4 years ago today, on the 17th of March 2016, in a ministerial statement to Parliament, Peter Gutwein, then as Treasurer, set out a range of principles that were to guide the gaming reform process in Tasmania. A notable point made in his statement that day 4 years ago was this: the process that led to the development of the earlier deeds caused concern in the community and cast a shadow over the appropriateness of the structural arrangements. The government does not want a repeat of this outcome. There needs to be a fully transparent public consultation process that enables interested Tasmanians to have their say on the future structure of the gaming sector post-2023, with the government's policy position as the starting point. On the same day, Premier Hodgman's media release also emphasised the importance of a transparent process. It said, "Today, the government announced a new way forward for gaming in Tasmania, which makes a clean break with the secretive ways of the past." The Hodgman and now Gutwein government have completely failed to honour that statement. There's been no process by which the government's policy has been appropriately scrutinised and assessed in an open, public and accountable manner. In fact, interested Tasmanians, as I mentioned, have been specifically excluded from having their say on the government policy, even in responding to this current consultation paper. The industry-written proposal, which later was adopted by the government, is not reflective of the evidence, the findings or the recommendations made by the Joint Committee in 2017. The principles that were taken to that committee for examination by the government, and the committee diligently spent many months going through submission process, hearing processes and consideration of that material based on those principles initially taken to the committee, then were presented right at the end with that industry proposal, which it didn't have time to examine. That industry proposal is what then became government policy, not the principles that were taken to the committee in the first place. So while the committee itself didn't have an opportunity to examine that industry proposal, dropped at the last minute, literally on the table of the committee, they did seek some expert advice on it. They sought some expert comment on that industry proposal, which subsequently became the government policy. They sought it from the Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission and Synergies, the research group that were helping the committee across that time. Now, the Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission's thoughts on this industry proposal, which became government policy, are actually documented. They're documented in the appendix of that committee's report. The committee attached it in the appendix. It's on page, I believe, 201 in Appendix D. Now, the Tasmanian Liquor and Gaming Commission, the independent body that was created to provide expert advice to the Tasmanian government, actually raised, in their assessment of that industry proposal, numerous concerns. They had numerous concerns that it was not the most suitable option for our state. They had concerns about individual licensing models. They had concerns about the rates of taxation and many other matters. It's all there to see. There is nothing to tell us what the government has done with those concerns. All we know is the government took that proposal, upon which concerns had been raised by its expert independent body, and now it is the policy that we have before us right now, the policy that we are not allowed to comment on. I think something is missing from that sequence of events. I think a lot of openness and transparency is missing from that sequence of events. I think there is absolutely no way in which the Tasmanian people or us here as legislators can have confidence that this policy is actually indicated as the best option going forward and is the best option we could hope to achieve on behalf of our community. And we can't have that confidence because we've never been given the opportunity to examine it. And that's simply not good enough. We need to go back to that step that allows for the Tasmanian community to develop the confidence and the trust that this is the right way forward. And that is why, in my motion, I make the call there at the bottom, the call that says in point 2, that we call on the Tasmanian government to undertake and publicly release modelling on the social and economic impacts of the proposed new poker machine licensing arrangements to be introduced to Tasmania in 2023.
Through you, Mr. President, can I just have a slight bit of clarity on that? To undertake, calls on the Tasmanian government to undertake and publicly release modelling. Is it undertake the survey
Well,
and release the modelling, or is it?
no, well, I
just
actually
need
put both those words in there because I'm not sure whether they've done it for themselves. We would hope that the government would have modelled what might occur as a result of its policy, either in various social outcomes and in various economic outcomes. So not just say who gets what in terms of divvying up the thing, but if we change to this model, what will it mean to our broader hospitality industry? What will it mean to the pubs that don't have poker machines? What will it mean to our economy overall? Those sorts of things. So to ask, what are we likely to see if we put this in place? So I would hope that they've done it, and that's what's informed their decision-making to produce the policy that they have. If they haven't done it, what I'm calling on them to do is to do it. So the undertake part of that is to say, if you haven't done it, I think it should be do it and then release it so we can all see it. Does that clarify a little bit what I mean there?
I think it's both modelling and the actual work behind that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I was clear on that. Thank you.
It's just, if we just keep it as simple as possible, I want to know, how do they know what will come about in terms of social and economic outcomes if this policy is put in place? And what work, I think they should do work and present that work that shows us what we could expect.
Yep.
If we don't have that information, certainly for us in considering our job here, how can we do the job we're sent here to do by our communities? How can we undertake the scrutiny? How can we undertake that rigorous assessment, that holding the government to account, if we don't have the information available that shows what we could expect to see from this policy?
Thank you.
That's the essence of this call. Mr. President, having spent 2 decades working in the social services sector, public policy, advocacy, research, in the past 5 years talking with thousands of Tasmanians about the harm caused by poker machines in this state, I'm deeply concerned that we are not just missing an opportunity to make things better, but that we're actively heading towards an outcome that's far worse. And I think it's incumbent upon the government to demonstrate to the Tasmanian people that that's not the case.
Question is that the motion be agreed to.